Welcome to my channel, Wonderful Seagulls. If you enjoy this podcast and want to support the channel, please subscribe. So, if you've ever sat on a park bench on a sunny afternoon, just minding your own business, and had a French fry brazenly stolen right out of your hand by a gull, it is incredibly easy to look at that bird and just think of it as a flying raccoon.
Oh, absolutely. That classic beach bum stereotype is, well, it's deeply ingrained in how we view them. People generally assume these birds just sort of stumble into our concrete environments by accident, found a discarded hot dog and just decided to stay out of pure convenience.
Yeah, totally. We have this collective image of them as opportunistic scavengers, just loud nuisances hanging out in grocery store parking lots because they're, I don't know, too lazy to live in nature.
Right, but we don't typically look at a gull perched on a street lamp and see a marvel of evolutionary adaptation. And that's really what they are.
Exactly. And that's why today we're doing a deep dive into a huge stack of research, specifically focusing on urban seagull colonization research. And it turns out that lazy scavenger stereotype you mentioned is just completely backwards. Our mission today is to unpack why this massive shift of gulls trading the open ocean for concrete jungles isn't a story of laziness at all. It's actually a necessary, highly specialized evolutionary survival strategy.
It really is. The gulls that are navigating human skylines today are part of a highly selective group. I mean, they are actively adapting to human-dominated landscapes out of absolute survival necessity. When you look closely at the data, what we're witnessing is one of the most significant rapid ecological shifts of our time, and it's happening right above our heads.
I really want to break down the mechanics of this because before we can even get into why these birds are moving into our cities, I'm struggling to understand how they're even physically and mentally capable of pulling it off. A city is a radically different environment than a flat, open ocean.
Oh, completely different.
And the research points out that not all gull species are making this move, right? Like, some are thriving in cities and some absolutely are not.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The capacity to colonize an urban space requires a really specific evolutionary toolkit, and it basically begins with their cognitive hardware. The research highlights a very robust correlation between a species' relative brain size and its ability to breed in urban environments. So we're talking about birds that possess significant cognitive flexibility.
Okay, but when you say cognitive flexibility, what does that actually look like in the day-to-day life of a bird? Because I imagine a city is basically just a sensory overload machine.
Oh, it's a chaotic, highly complex, three-dimensional maze for them. Think about, the erratic distribution of food. A dumpster might be overflowing one day and totally emptied the next. Add to that the massive amounts of human disturbance, traffic noise, artificial lighting.
Right, there's just so much input.
Exactly. To survive all that, a bird needs a brain capable of high behavioral plasticity, meaning they can constantly update their understanding of the world, solve new problems, and actually learn from experience rather than just relying on fixed instincts. And evolutionarily, this big brain adaptability in gulls is closely linked to a specific ancestral trait, which is cliff nesting.
Wait, cliff nesting. So nesting on cliffs is a newer evolutionary development for them.
Well, the common ancestor of all gulls was most likely a ground nester, laying eggs on flat beaches or grassy islands. But certain species evolved to utilize coastal cliffs for breeding, birds like the European herring gull or the lesser black-backed gull. The data shows these cliff-nesting species actually evolved larger brains than their ground-nesting cousins just to handle the complex spatial memory and the aerodynamics required to live on sheer vertical rock faces.
Oh, wow. Okay, so to a cliff nesting gull, a modern city isn't some weird alien concrete jungle. It's essentially just a really jagged coastline.
Precisely. A skyscraper or a towering chimney perfectly mimics those sheer rock faces.
That makes perfect sense. And in the wild, the whole point of nesting on a terrifyingly high cliff ledge is to get away from ground predators, right? Like foxes or weasels.
You get high up on an inaccessible ledge, and suddenly terrestrial predators are completely removed from the equation. The researchers compiled data that is incredibly striking on this point. Over 50% of all cliff nesting gull species have been recorded using urban spaces today.
50%? That's huge.
Yeah, but when you look at the strictly ground nesting species, only about 11% have managed to make the transition.
Wow. Okay, so I get the brain size and the behavioral preference for high rises.
Right.
But physically, I mean, a gull is a large bird. I've seen them up close. How are they navigating power lines, narrow alleys, and the chaotic wind tunnels created by tall buildings without just smashing into things?
That's a great question. Because morphology, the actual physical shape of the bird, is a massive constraint on urban living, the researchers use a measurement called the hand wing index, or HWI.
Hand wing index, got it.
Right. It's essentially a metric of wing pointiveness and aerodynamic efficiency. The data clearly shows that the gulls successfully living in cities have significantly lower HWIs, meaning their wings are relatively shorter and broader compared to their body size.
Okay, let me try an analogy here for the listener to make sure I'm visualizing the aerodynamics right. Think of a pelagic gull, a gull that spends its entire life out on the vast open ocean. That bird has a high HWI, making it kind of like a commercial jet. It's perfectly designed for long, steady, highly efficient flights, riding predictable ocean winds.
Yeah, exactly.
But an urban gull, with its low HWI and shorter wings, is much more like a nimble sports car. It has a really tight turning radius, which is perfectly designed for darting through narrow city alleys, dodging buildings, and making rapid takeoffs from a confined balcony.
That is a brilliant way to visualize the physics of it. Those strictly pelagic species, like Sabine's gull or the black-legged kittiwake, have those long, highly pointed commercial jet wings. If you place a bird with that wing structure into a downtown metropolitan area, it simply cannot handle the turbulent, chaotic updrafts that violently bounce off skyscrapers.
So they just get tossed around.
Exactly. Their wings just don't allow for the necessary micro-adjustments in flight.
That is fascinating. So the next time you see a gull perfectly balanced on a swaying street lamp or just weaving effortlessly through moving traffic, you aren't just looking at a lost beach bird. You are looking at a highly evolved acrobat, perfectly suited for that exact environment.
You really are. But, the physical and mental toolkit is a prerequisite. Having the right equipment is only half the story. Just because a species can live in a city doesn't explain why they would completely abandon their natural ocean habitats to do so.
Right, right. If the ocean was providing everything they needed, why bother moving to a noisy, polluted city in the first place? Something must have forced them out.
This transition is fundamentally a story of environmental collapse. The primary driver pushing these birds inland is the global decline of traditional marine food sources. Over the last century, industrial overfishing has pushed a massive percentage of the world's fish stocks well beyond biological limits.
So the oceans are quite literally being emptied of the small forage fish these gulls rely on.
Unfortunately, yes. The research details a really stark example of this happening in the Salish Sea in the Pacific Northwest. There is a systemic collapse of high-quality forage fish there, specifically species like eulachon and Pacific herring.
And this forced the local glaucous-winged gulls to completely alter their diets.
Right. And the methodology researchers use to track this dietary shift is fascinating. They analyzed 149 years of feather samples from those specific gulls, looking at isotopic signatures.
Wait, how does that work? The feathers hold a record of what they ate.
Basically, yes. Feathers are primarily made of keratin. And as a bird grows a feather, it permanently traps a chemical snapshot of the exact nutrients the bird was consuming at that specific time. By analyzing museum specimens from a century ago compared to modern birds, scientists observed a profound shift.
That is incredible. So what did this snapshot show?
These birds went from eating high-energy, lipid-rich marine fish to subsisting heavily on low-quality terrestrial garbage.
And obviously, you cannot build a thriving, healthy population on human junk food.
You really can't. This forced dietary shift directly correlates with lower natural fertility rates and severe population declines in more traditional coastal colonies. The adult birds simply don't have the nutritional energy required to successfully raise young on a diet of discarded bread and landfill waste.
I want to pause here because this completely shatters that common assumption we talked about at the beginning. It's so easy to see a gull eating a discarded hot dog and think they're just getting lazy, like they've discovered an all-you-can-eat garbage buffet and decided honest fishing was too much work.
Yeah, that's the narrative.
But the feather data proves it isn't a choice, is it? We essentially emptied their natural pantry, leaving them with no alternative but to find a new one.
It is entirely a forced migration, and starvation wasn't the only factor pushing them out of their ancestral homes. Disease in natural colonies has been devastating. Traditional gulls nest in incredibly huge, dense colonies on beaches or remote islands. You have thousands of birds packed tightly together, covered in guano.
Right, so when a pathogen is introduced, it just sweeps through the population like wildfire.
Exactly. The research specifically mentioned the Severn Estuary in the UK. Outbreaks of botulism in the soil and water there absolutely decimated the island colonies. Between the 1970s and 1990s, a gull population dropped by 50% purely due to disease.
Wait, but if disease was wiping out the island colonies, why were the birds that had already moved to the cities staying safe?
Because of the density differences. A single breeding pair isolated on the roof of a bank building doesn't transmit disease the way thousands of birds crammed beak to beak on a muddy shoreline do. So famine and plague are aggressively pushing them away from the coast. And simultaneously, human beings were inadvertently creating massive pull factors, building the perfect artificial habitats for them.
The urban subsidies. This historical angle really blew my mind. It wasn't just a gradual realization by the birds that cities had dropped food. This migration was heavily accelerated by specific human legislation, like the 1956 Clean Air Act in Britain.
The Clean Air Act is a textbook example of unintended ecological consequences. The legislation was urgently needed to combat severe, deadly smog in British cities. To clear the air, the government basically forbade the burning of refuse at municipal disposal sites.
So before this, garbage was incinerated.
Right. But after the act, massive volumes of waste simply had to be dumped and covered with inert material at the end of each day.
Which means suddenly, thousands of tons of edible human food waste that used to be burned to ash was just sitting out in massive open-air piles every single day.
Yeah.
We built reliable daily buffets.
We really did. And because these cliff nesting birds possess that incredible cognitive flexibility we discussed, they learn to exploit this new resource with terrifying efficiency. They demonstrate what ecologists call high sight fidelity and remarkable temporal awareness.
Temporal awareness, meaning they know what time it is.
Exactly. In Bristol, researchers observed gulls literally memorizing human schedules. They time their daily foraging trips perfectly to match the school break times of local kids. They know exactly when sandwiches and snacks will be dropped in the schoolyards, and they even synchronize with the operating hours of local waste management centers.
They know when the recess bell rings.
Yeah.
That level of intelligence is wild. And when you look at the timeline in the research, this whole urbanization process started as a tiny trickle and then became an absolute flood.
Oh, yeah, the timeline is very telling.
There were some isolated incidents of urban nesting in Bulgaria way back in the 1890s, but post-World War II, it exploded globally. The UK saw massive shifts in the 1940s, North America and Italy in the 1970s, and Australia in the 1980s.
The timeline tracks perfectly with the post-war boom in urban development, the explosion of single-use consumer waste, plastic, and, of course, the concurrent industrialization of global fishing fleets that aggressively depleted their natural prey.
Okay, so they are pushed into the city by starvation and disease,
Mm.
and they are drawn in by these predictable unburned buffets and towering rooftop cliffs. But, I mean, the ultimate test of any evolutionary strategy is reproduction. Does this urban gamble actually pay off for their survival?
The reproductive ecology data is staggering. The best metric we have for this is fledgling success rates. That's the percentage of hatched chicks that actually survive long enough to grow their flight feathers, leave the nest, and become independent.
And the numbers from Vancouver really stopped me in my tracks. In Vancouver, the urban breeding gulls had an 89% post-hatch fledging success rate.
Yeah.
89%. Meanwhile, the non-urban colonies out in the natural Salish Sea had a completely dismal 10% success rate, 10% versus 89%.
That differential is astronomical in ecological terms. And to understand why, we have to look at the real estate itself, the rooftop advantage. We already established that rooftops mimic cliffs, providing height to avoid terrestrial predators like foxes, dogs, or cats.
Right.
And aerial predators like bald eagles generally refuse to hunt in cities because they just can't maneuver their massive wingspans through the dense human traffic, power lines, and cluttered architecture. But the absolute biggest factor driving that 89% survival rate is actually protection from other gulls.
Why are they a threat to each other?
Well, gulls are incredibly territorial and aggressively cannibalistic toward unfamiliar chicks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In a natural ground colony, nests are spaced only a few feet apart. If a growing chick wanders just slightly out of its parent's immediate territory, the neighboring adults will mercilessly attack and frequently kill it. In natural colonies, neighbor aggression is the primary cause of infant mortality.
That paints such a brutal picture of nature. Let me frame it this way for you. Instead of being forced to raise your kids on a chaotic, crowded beach where your neighbors might literally eat them if they step over an invisible line, the city offers you an exclusive, private penthouse suite in the sky.
That's exactly what it is.
Usually there is only one breeding pair per commercial rooftop. The physical edges of the building mean the chicks literally cannot wander into enemy territory until they're old enough to fly away. It's basically an impenetrable, gated community.
It's a brilliantly effective strategy for ensuring chick survival. And beyond the physical protection, cities also provide the urban heat island effect. Millions of tons of concrete and asphalt absorb solar radiation during the day and release it at night, making the microclimate of a city significantly warmer than the surrounding countryside.
Oh, so they get a climate advantage too.
Yes. This extra warmth allows urban gulls to start nesting and reproducing earlier in the spring season compared to their wild counterparts, giving their chicks a much longer period to grow before winter sets in.
But the research did highlight one sobering detail amidst all this success. Even with this amazing penthouse survival rate, the overall clutch sizes, meaning the actual number of eggs a female lays to begin with, are steadily dropping.
Right. It's an important nuance. Urban living doesn't grant them immunity from broader environmental degradation. The region-wide decline in high-quality marine food webs means the adult birds still have less overall biological energy to invest in producing eggs.
Because producing an egg takes massive nutritional resources.
Exactly. So they lay fewer eggs overall. However, because of the extreme safety of the urban rooftop environment, they are vastly more successful at keeping the few chicks they do manage to hatch alive.
They are maximizing the hand they've been dealt. Which kind of brings up my next question. What does the daily routine of a city gull actually look like? Are they just sitting on those penthouses all day waiting for a dumpster to open? Because if they're a vital part of the ecosystem, how is this urbanization changing the broader landscape?
Oh, they are anything but stationary. Their movement patterns are highly dynamic. We tend to think of urban gulls as being confined entirely to the city limits, picking at trash cans, but tracking data proves otherwise. They operate essentially as global commuters.
Commuters.
Yeah. In the UK, GPS tracking shows that urban nesting lesser black-backed gulls spend about a third of their time commuting out of the city to forage in rural agricultural fields, particularly when they are rearing chicks.
I found that detail so counterintuitive. If they love the safety of the city so much, and human garbage provides an endless calorie buffet, why go through the massive energy expenditure of flying miles out to the country just to hunt for worms? Are they just hedging their bets?
It really comes down to nutritional balancing. Human refuse is incredibly high in raw calories, like fats and carbohydrates, but it severely lacks the specific micronutrients and proteins that rapidly growing chicks require for healthy bone and feather development.
Oh, okay.
The adults instinctively know they need to supplement the junk food with agricultural pests, earthworms, and insects found in rural fields. But the ecological consequence of this daily commute is profound. By moving continuously back and forth, these gulls act as biovectors.
Meaning they're acting as biological transport vehicles.
Yeah.
Moving materials between completely distinct ecosystems.
Precisely. They're creating landscape connectivity. A gull might forage in an industrial waste management center or a sewage treatment plant in the morning, picking up heavy metals, nutrients, and human-associated bacteria. Then they commute back to the city center and defecate in a residential park, a drinking water reservoir, or a school playground in the afternoon. They are physically bridging ecosystems that would otherwise never interact, redistributing massive amounts of nutrients and microbes across the landscape.
That is a very real public health and sanitation dynamic that city planners need to be intensely aware of. And it's fascinating how specifically they navigate these diverse spaces. The Kanto, Japan tracking data was a great example of this.
Oh, yes.
Researchers tracked black-headed gulls there and found they used the urban river systems almost entirely as flight corridors. They aren't even stopping to fish in the water. They're just using the unobstructed open airspace directly above the river as a highway to bypass the ultra-dense, complicated architecture of the surrounding city.
It highlights how seamlessly they have mapped human infrastructure into their spatial memory. And this isn't isolated to a few regions. It's causing sweeping municipal changes globally. In Venice, Italy, the historical center actually had to overhaul its entire waste infrastructure in 2016, moving to strict door-to-door trash collection.
Just because of the gulls.
Yes. The population of yellow-legged gulls had exploded from just a few isolated pairs to dozens in a matter of years, causing intense conflicts with tourists over exposed waste.
Wow. And in Australia, the silver gull has completely dominated coastal cities like Sydney and Melbourne. But the research also points out the much darker side of this transition.
Yeah.
For species that don't have that evolutionary toolkit we talked about, the story is tragic.
It really is.
The vulnerable Saunders gull in South Korea isn't thriving in human spaces. Its natural tidal flats were destroyed by aggressive coastal development, forcefully pushing the birds onto reclaimed industrial land.
And because they lack that cliff nesting instinct, they stay on the ground.
Exactly. There, they face incredibly high nest predation from stray mammals. They are trapped in an environment they just aren't equipped for.
It perfectly illustrates the harsh dichotomy of the Anthropocene, the current geological age dominated by human activity. For species possessing the right toolkit, the large brain, the cliff nesting history, the low hand-wing index, the modern city is a haven. For those without it, human expansion is basically a death sentence. This realization brings us to a concept researchers call the urban refugia hypothesis.
A refugia being a sanctuary, meaning ecologists don't see the city as just a temporary stopgap or a marginal habitat anymore.
Historically, ecology viewed urban habitats as low-quality, temporary spillover areas for wildlife. But as our oceans face unrelenting, compounding pressures from climate change, plastic pollution, and overfishing, these stable, predator-free, artificially warmed, food-rich, concrete jungles are becoming permanent ecological strongholds. For many gull species, cities are no longer a backup plan. They are the primary refuge keeping the species alive.
So taking all this research into account, what does this ultimately mean for our relationship with these birds?
It requires a fundamental shift in perspective. Gull urbanization is a profound, permanent evolutionary event. It really is an absolute masterclass in cognitive and morphological adaptation. These birds have taken catastrophic human mistakes, the destruction of coastal habitats, the over-extraction of marine webs, our inefficient waste management, and they've exploited our architecture to survive.
Right.
We must stop viewing them as invasive pests and recognize that they are highly successful ecological refugees who have permanently moved in.
I completely agree, and that leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to ponder. Earlier, we discussed the concept of site fidelity. The fact that these rooftop chicks survive at incredibly high rates, and when they mature, they instinctively return to the exact same urban environments they hatched in to raise their own young.
Yes, the cycle repeats itself.
Right, which means we might be witnessing real-time accelerated evolution. Decades from now, will the genets of these city-dwelling penthouse birds become so genetically, morphologically, and behaviorally distinct that they no longer recognize or even breed with their wild ocean-faring cousins? We might literally be watching the real-time birth of a brand new species, the true urban gull. Bye for now, and thanks for watching Wonderful Seagulls. Please like and subscribe to help this channel grow.